our next to the last class. Next week is our last class. And we'd like to devote the last class entirely to discussion of questions and propositions that you bring to the class, related or not to the papers that you will be writing. To enrich our discussion, it would be very useful if you could reflect between now and then and come prepared. Come prepared to engage actively and to help us conduct that last class and make the best out of it. The subject matter today is the choice, the inescapable choice among different ways of approaching the conduct of life, and the nature of the grounds that we can hope to have for such choices. And I'm going to begin today's class in the spirit of helping to set up the discussion. And I divide my remarks into three parts. First, I want to begin by going back to our very first class, to the point of departure in the course. And to say something or to restate something about our subject matter, the subject matter of what we have called these first-order projects in the conduct of life. Then in the second part of my remarks, I want to again explore the nature of the discourse in philosophy and in religion about these first-order projects, the general characteristics of this discourse as it has developed in history. And that then, in turn, leads to the main point, the third step of my remarks, which is what I want to call the cognitive deficit or imbalance. We must choose, if not explicitly, then implicitly, among these alternative ways of approaching the conduct of life. But our grounds for choice always seem to be inadequate or incomplete, and disproportionate in their limited adequacy to the enormous weight of the choice that we are required to make in directing our lives in one way or another. That's what I mean by the cognitive deficit. So first, the subject matter of the course. The subject matter of the course has been the exploration of what we have called first-order projects in the conduct of life. By contrast to the dominant subject matter in academic moral theory, which can be described as meta-ethics. In the academy today, moral philosophy is primarily discussed from the standpoint of the rivalry of certain major methods of thinking, and in particular, three schools of thought: the utilitarian or consequentialist, the Kantian or deontological, and the social contract view. Now, we discussed in the very first class Parfit's thesis that these three positions, the rivalry among which occupies a large part of academic moral philosophy, are in fact equivalent. We mentioned three interpretations of this supposed equivalence. One interpretation is the one offered by Parfit himself. Their equivalence is a sign of their truth. A second interpretation is the opposite. Their equivalence is a consequence of their emptiness. And a third interpretation is that their equivalence results from their expression of a particular point of view, which is the point of view of an altruistic universalism. We shifted the focus away from this rather empty meta-ethics to the discussion of what to do with our lives, how to live life. That's what these first-order projects are about. And in particular, we focused on the projects that have emerged in the last 2,000 or so years against the background of momentous inflections, transformations, sometimes brought under the label of the axial age, that took place in a more than 1,000 year period, from slightly before the second half of the first millennium before Christ to the first half of the first millennium after Christ. That is to say, from the rise of prophetic Judaism to the prophetic activity of Muhammad. And in between, the rise of major philosophical and religious positions, such as Buddhism and Confucianism. All of the first-order projects that we discussed in the course emerged from this common background of the axial age transformations. And as a result, they have certain common elements. The first common element is they assume a desanctification of nature. And they see the divine as being beyond the natural world. And thus they organize in different ways what is sometimes called a dialectic between transcendence and immanence. The divine exceeds the world, but then becomes manifest in the world. When it exceeds, it is transcendence. When it is manifest, it is immanence. A second characteristic of all of these views is that they affirm that all the divisions within humanity, of class, of caste, of sex, of temperament, are all shallow in comparison to our fundamental unity, to our common fate. A third characteristic of these views is that they reject what was before them the predominant ethic. The ethic in particular associated with the ruling and fighting classes. The ethic of martial valor and proud self-assertion. They reject that ethic in favor of an ethic of universal fellow feeling. A fifth characteristic of these views, a fourth characteristic, is that they are all concerned with what I called in that first class the irreparable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, our groundlessness, our insatiability, and our susceptibility to belittlement. And this last, our susceptibility to belittlement, may not be an irreparable flaw. It may be a feature of our experience that we can change or overcome, unlike the others, unlike the other three. And there's a final characteristic, a fifth characteristic of all of these projects, that in them, characteristically, there is an ambiguity, an ambivalence between two messages. To what extent are they an invitation to change the world in a certain way, in a certain direction? And to what extent are they simply a redescription of the world that would reconcile us to the world as it is? Are they a provocation to transform, or are they a license to escape? Now, against that common background, we considered two main sets of first-order projects. Some of them were penetrated by the spirit of Christianity, or more generally of the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And these first-order projects have in common an emphasis on two sets of characteristics. First, they affirm the infinity of the human being, that we are shaped by context, in context, but that we transcend context, and that somehow we share in the life and in the character of God. And their second characteristic is that they affirm that we are saved by our relation to the others, and that our reckoning with the others is a crucial element in our salvation, in our lifting up to a higher form of life and to a widening of our share in the life of God. So there is some deep relation between our divinization and our solidarity. And then there were other first-order projects that we considered, such as Buddhism and its philosophical counterpart in the West, for example, in the philosophy of Schopenhauer, or Confucianism, that do not share this particular orientation of the Semitic monotheisms, at least not in the same way. That has been the subject matter of the course. To understand the architecture and the consequences of some of these first-order positions. Now I come to the second set of remarks. The second set of remarks is about the nature of the discourse in which these first-order projects have been articulated and in which we can engage them. So this is a discourse that crosses the boundaries between what we conventionally describe as philosophy and what we ordinarily call religion. And it is a discourse which also has certain fundamental and persistent characteristics. The first characteristic is that these views, the ideas in which these first-order projects are expressed and developed, are comprehensive views. They are views about our whole situation. And, moreover, they demand to penetrate the whole of personal and social experience. They refuse to be privatized. So from this standpoint, the privatization of religion or of fundamental philosophy is an anomaly in the history of our spiritual experience. A second characteristic of this discourse is that it anchors an existential imperative, an orientation to the living of life in a vision of reality, and especially of our reality, of who we are. A third characteristic, intimately related to that second, is that this discourse crosses the divide between the is and the ought, between claims about the facts of the matter and normative ideas about what to do, how to live, and how to organize society. And to make sense of this crossing of the divide between the is and the ought, we might say that that distinction between the is and the ought makes sense only to the extent that our ideas are localized ideas, ideas about some segment of our experience. But insofar as our ideas are global ideas, ideas about our whole situation and its transformative prospects, the division between the is and the ought begins to break down or ceases to make sense. A fourth characteristic of the discourse that is common to the discussion of these first-order projects is that it elicits faith, and faith in a double sense. So the first and fundamental sense of faith is that we have to choose. We can't escape choice. Our choice may be implicit in the way we live rather than explicit in our ideas, but by the way we live, we will show how we have chosen, what choice we have made. And it seems, and this will be the next subject that I want to discuss, that the grounds that we have for these momentous choices are always disproportionate to the weight of the choice. The choice is the most important choice that we can make, what we can do with our lives. And we have grounds to make these choices, but the grounds seem never to be enough, never to be conclusive, never to be at the same level as the weight of the choice itself. That's the first and fundamental sense of faith. So there's a gap, what I'm calling a cognitive gap, a deficit, between the demands of the choice and the adequacy of the grounds. And then there is a second and derivative sense of faith, which is because we must engage our lives in one direction or another without ever having conclusive grounds for this engagement, we become, in the course of that engagement, more vulnerable to others. We put ourselves in the hands of others. And that then is the second sense of faith, faith as trust, faith as heightened vulnerability, the heightened vulnerability that results from our engagement. And now then I come to the third object of my remarks, which is the central theme set for our discussion today, which is then the question of these grounds, the grounds we have for choice among the first-order projects, having to do with faith in the first sense of faith, the cognitive imbalance. Now, let's begin with three kinds of grounds which are clearly powerful influences on our choices, but which are manifestly disturbing. So the first ground, the first kind of ground for choice is just the situation or the tradition into which we happen to have been born. So that we were born, for example, in Europe or the United States rather than in China, or vice versa. and therefore, or that our parents believed in one God rather than in another. And then our beliefs about these first-order projects are shaped by these accidents of birth and historical circumstance. Now, a second disturbing kind of ground for choosing among these first-order projects is our temperament. So humanity is divided by temperaments, not just by religions and classes. The division of temperaments is one of the fundamental divisions of humanity. I cited to you this paradox in Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer says in the introduction to The World as Will and Representation in the preface, my philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence. And yet in the content of the book, of the text, he also says a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. And it seems that these two things cannot both be true, unless we believe that a certain kind of temperament has a privilege as a vehicle of the truth. Now then, we come to a third kind of disturbing influence. And the third kind of disturbing influence is the pursuit of solace. The feel-good element in the history of religion and of philosophy. And in particular, solace with respect to the irreparable flaws in the human condition, and especially the fact that each of us will die. So it's as if the whole point of the discourse were then for us to cast a spell on ourselves that would reconcile us to these irreparable flaws, either by providing some antidote to them or by denying that they really are irreparable. And as in the case of a placebo in medicine, for it to work, we have to think that the placebo is not a placebo. We have to deceive ourselves in some way. So these are all disturbing grounds for choice. Now, they will always be powerful influences on our choices of first-order projects of life. And the real question is whether they are the only influences, or whether we can find in our experience and in our intellectual activity a way of counterbalancing these influences, of going beyond them. And that then leads us back to the question of what I'm calling the cognitive deficit. So let's think then of what might be beyond the reach of these influences, the possible grounds of choice among these first-order projects of life. So each of these first-order projects is a promise of happiness. And then the question is, what happens when we try to enact these promises? Will the promises be kept or not? Will the first-order project, when we act it out, be what it claims to be or produce the result that it promises? Each of these projects, or the ideas standing behind them, is a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent. It says, in effect, act as if I were true, and you will make me true. But none of them is completely self-fulfilling. The circle doesn't close, because reality fights back. The reality of the world and the reality of who we are. And it might be that each of these self-fulfilling prophecies turns out to be self-subversive or self-discrediting in a certain way. So the question is, are the promises kept? Or if they're violated, what is the significance of the violation? Will we be happy as they promise us that we will be if we act on them? And now there is a complication. And a complication is an ambiguity in our ideas about happiness. Is happiness the absence of pain, of suffering? Is it a negation of suffering? Or is happiness some kind of fullness of activity that requires contradiction and therefore tension and therefore, in a sense, suffering? Suffering is part of happiness in an ascent to a higher form of experience and of being. Now then, there's a second set of grounds for choice beyond those disturbing influences. And the second set of grounds for choice has to do with the compatibility of each of these first-order projects or of the ideas standing behind them with the facts about the world or about us. So a first-order project, like the first-order projects emerging from the background of the Semitic monotheisms, of Christianity in particular, views us as embodied spirit, formed in context, but transcending context. The contexts are finite, we are infinite. We struggle with them and overcome them and change them. Each of them is dust in the face of God and don't deserve idolatry. Well, the question is, will our personal and historical experience vindicate or not that belief that we exceed the context? And each of these first-order projects makes certain assumptions about the world. For example, is time real? Or is time illusory? Is reality associated with the escape from time? Or is everything that is real time-bound and mutable? And these aren't just choices we make. These are facts about the reality of the world and our reality. And although they are not facts that can be easily falsified or validated, the accumulation of experience, of discovery of the world, does throw light on their validity or their lack of validity. There is then a third set of grounds, and these are all connected in some way. They're not clear distinctions among them. The third set of grounds is the relation of these first-order projects to major transformations or expressions or inflections in the history of humanity. So I gave the example of the transformation associated with the axial age, those common attributes of the world religions, of the major philosophical positions. What is our attitude to these transformations? Do we see ourselves as continuing them? Do we cast our lot with them? Each of these transformations is the vehicle of a set of ideas and desires. But the transformations, or what happens in the course of this history, elucidate the character and the force of these ideas and desires, and lead us or not to reconsider them or reinterpret them. So there was that large project, the common project of these positions, that comes from these major changes that took place 2,000 years ago. And now in our modern history, there's another such major transformation. There is a revolutionary project in the world, in the last 200 years. It has a political face of democracy, liberalism, and socialism, and a personal face of personal liberation carried throughout the world by the worldwide popular romantic culture. It's not the only agenda in the world, but it is the agenda that commands the greatest attention of humanity. And all the other agendas either accepted or resisted. It is the strongest in that sense, but at the same time now it is weak because its adepts no longer know what its next step should be. So one way to understand what we've tried to do in the course is to examine these next steps on the moral side rather than on the political side. How can we give new life and new meaning to this revolutionary project? By reinterpreting it, by exploring its next steps. What we learn from the history of these momentous collective transformations in the spiritual experience of humanity provides us with another set of grounds for accepting or rejecting or for redesigning some of these first-order positions. It's their relation to this collective history, not simply to our individual experience. Now then, what emerges from this discussion? What emerges from this discussion is that the choice among these first-order projects is not a choice that we make entirely in the dark. Just almost in the dark. So we do have grounds, these fragmentary grounds that I just listed, that go beyond those disturbing influences. Those are the grounds that we have. But the grounds seem to be entirely inadequate, disproportionate to the weight of the choice that we have to make, which is to conduct our lives in one direction or another. So there is light, but a faint light by which we must make these fateful choices.
Please.
No, indeed. Well, let's let that soak in for a minute. Let me say, as we come to the end of this class, that it has been an unadulterated joy for me to spend every Wednesday with you all and with my two brothers here. That's Roberto Unger. Unique, distinctive, and singular as philosopher, social theorist, comprehensive vision, and at the same time always concerned with what's going on the ground. I apologize for my voice, but I've just completely run out of gas with my voice. Can you still hear me in the back? All right. It's just a little hoarse that way. And I had never met my dear brother Michael, and it's just been a delight to be with him, to hear his magnificent lectures, and to wrestle with what are probably the most terrifying questions that any of us will ever have to raise, which is what it is to be human, which is how to live and how to die. And there's no accident that when Brother Roberto begins with inescapable choice, and not to choose is to choose. You have to enact, either in the life you live or to articulate in the words that you utter, how you're responding to how to live, how to die. What weight would what the Greeks call arete, or greatness or excellence, play in your wrestling with those questions? What weight will love or empathy or compassion play as you wrestle with those questions? And we've still only been able to accent certain slices of the rich experience of the species, because we've talked about legacies of Athens and Jerusalem. We've talked about Buddhism and Confucianism. There's a whole host of other religions and civilizations that we couldn't touch on. But I do think there's something about what William James said in his great Gifford Lectures and the variety of religious experiences, where he talks about the core of the religious problem is the call for help. The call for help. The acknowledgement of one's own limitations and inadequacies, and the ways in which one can be viewed as a kind of being shot through with contradictions and incongruities and faults and foibles. George Santayana, who taught for 20 years here at Harvard, used to say, religion is the love of life in the consciousness of impotence. The love of life in the consciousness of impotence. When you recognize the very moment in which you are impotent, helpless, and calling for help, that inescapable choice, which becomes inseparable from what we talked about a few weeks ago in the Schopenhauer week, the week that was lost on the audio. So much for the power of technology and its comprehensive coverage. But the Schopenhauer week, we talked about inescapable death, inescapable dogma, inescapable domination. That you have to not just come to terms with the fact that your body will be extinguished and become the culinary delight of terrestrial worms unless you opt for cremation. You have to come to terms with the various forms of death that you would experience while you're alive, be it psychic and spiritual and so forth. But then also dogma, which is usually associated. We got our dear brother, is it Pinkster? Is that his name, Brother Steve? Mm-hmm. Pinkster with his best-selling book on things are on the up and up. We ought to be feeling good about this progress. You say, Brother Steve, what world are you living in? But we appreciate his voice. He needs somebody out there as Pangloss talking about the sunshine and talking about the breakthrough and talking about the progress. On those particular points, statistically, he's right. But when you actually then zero in on lived experience, even among the professional classes, even among the well-to-do classes, wrestling with the despair, wrestling with self-medication, wrestling with depression, wrestling with alienation, wrestling with isolation, ... The same subject matter comes back to what we've been wrestling with in this class. Inescapable dogmas tied to inescapable traditions. And Brother Roberto and I have been going back and forth. I've claimed that he tends at times to be tilted too much to the future and futurity, almost beginning to fetishize the future. And I call that a New World prejudice. Very American in the hemispheric sense. Not just USA. We don't want to imperialize that category. In the hemisphere, Brazil, Canada, United States, so forth. Whereas I'm as suspicious of the future as I am of the past and the present. And that's the difference between Chekhov and Whitman. That's the difference between the blues and Emerson. That's the difference between Gadamer and John Dewey, or Muriel Rukeyser. And it's a rich conversation because I'm very much for a similar kind of vision and analysis and political practice as my dear brother Roberto Unger. But when it comes to newness and innovation and future, I'm still very, very skeptical even as we proceed. And why is that so? Well, if it's inescapable dogma, inescapable tradition, the tradition contains various kinds of stories and narratives, most of those stories and narratives to be selectively interpreted because they were written under very different historical circumstances, often constituting the very scriptures for the religions that provide various responses to how to live. And what do you attempt to tease out? That's the question. That's the question. Roberto has talked quite eloquently throughout his career about reconciling greatness with love. It's a wonderful phrase I remember reading. I think it might be in the Pragmatism book, actually. You remember writing that? A long time ago, about 11 years ago, 2007. Reconciling greatness with love. Oh, that's a very rich and fecund formulation. Because if that's the best we can do as a species, is attempt to courageously, unflinchingly confront death in its various forms, recognizing that we're never going to have dogma-less ways of looking at the world. The question will be which kinds of dogma, and will those dogmas still be viewed in light of their history, because every dogma has a history. That's why time goes all the way down. History goes all the way down. So all we have are these traditions, but have been created, invented, constructed over time, wrestling with these perennial questions of how to live, with a personal side and a political side, an existential side and an economic side, a spiritual side and a social side, dealing with the whole person. And we know that's a fundamental challenge in the world in which we live, where we often confuse the disciplinary division of knowledge with the way the world is. Economics over here, sociology over here, philosophy over here, computers over here, math over here, because that's what I majored in. Your professional projection, as you are located in a disciplinary division of knowledge, in a managerial professional site in the capitalist civilization, Harvard. And the question becomes, how do you seize the best of that circumstance, but also historicize that circumstance and recognize that that disciplinary division of knowledge itself has a history with its own blind spots, with its own limitations, as well as its own strengths, as well as its own virtue. We began this class with a critique of academic moral philosophy. It began with certain ideal types of consequentialism, utilitarianism, continental, social contract theory, and so forth. And we acknowledge that there's people who are inside of the academy, in philosophy departments, who do have interest in what we talk about, because ideal types are always different than what the complex, complicated reality is on the ground. But we were keeping track of the dominant tendencies and why it is that it's so difficult to have a class in the conduct of life, how to live, the first order projects that Roberto was talking about, and have us to wrestle with it as if somehow we can get some critical distance from the disciplinary division of knowledge in the context in which we find ourselves. Inescapable death, inescapable dogma of some sort, inescapable domination. Domination not simply political, economic, imperial, but also intellectual. Also intellectual. Is it possible to conceive of a conduct of life in which you don't view yourself as being asked to enlist in a particular philosophical army or religious army? I think one of the things we have to recognize, that even when we talk about these various traditions, I would hope that we're flexible and fluid enough to recognize if you're in the tradition of Confucianism, you can still learn a hell of a lot from the legacy of Athens. If you're secular, you can still learn a hell of a lot from Buddhism. If you're Buddhist, you can still learn a hell of a lot from pagans like Aristotle or Sophocles or Plato. We have to learn how to cross-pollinate and cross-fertilize, because in the end, and this is where it's blues-like, it's about finding your voice. Just like when you die, your death or it's like when you fall into your love. It's just you, even though the you that we're talking about has been historically shaped, socially influenced, and deeply, deeply challenged by what has come before. I get the stress on the tradition that is dynamic, a tradition that is forever being radically reconstructed over time. And I think in the end, it's a matter of looking at one's life in part from the vantage point of one's funeral. But when your body's laying in that coffin, based on how you lived, what kind of response did your lived or your living, what kind of response was it to the how to live? With all of the reflection, all of the interpretations, all of the various descriptions of these various traditions, these various stories and narratives that we talked about. Let me stop there and hand it over to my dear brother. Then we're going to open it up.
Well, let me begin, too, by thanking both Roberto and Cornell. It's been extraordinary being here with the two of you, and equally extraordinary being here with all of you, too. Your comments and discussions have been extraordinary. And let me just begin by echoing the points that Roberto and Cornell have been giving. If you read the popular press, you would quickly get the impression that we are currently, and have now been for about 3 decades, living in a time, and I'll pick up some words that you can see just repeated constantly in the press, of unprecedented change, rapid globalization, tremendous dislocation, but this sense of incredible excitement about what is going on. That's one way of describing the world. I think a better way, sadly, of describing the world would be almost the precise opposite. That we are living in a period in which, and this is rare when you get a period where this is so solidified, where basically for the past 3 decades there has been one vision, namely neoliberalism, that has been unbelievably dominant. The view, to quote, one of the rare times I will ever do so, Margaret Thatcher, one of the architects of this, who said, well, even if you don't like these policies, there's no alternative, right? It's the only thing we can do. We've tried all the other great isms. They were horrible disasters. This is all that we've got, so just live with it. And that has basically been, I think, the overriding ideology of the past 3 decades. There have been very few people who I think actively think neoliberalism has been a good thing. I mean, there are a few, the tiny 0.1 of the 1% might have. In general, I think very few have been. I think a good way to describe this for the past 3 decades is we're all unhappy neoliberals, right? We do not think this is leading to a particularly good world. We can see the unbelievable economic inequality it's creating, the extraordinary devastation of the world that could literally endanger all life within 3 generations. We see the horrible things going on around us, and yet the sense is, well, there just is no other alternative. Economically, this is the only way things can work. Politically, you have to have a system that can maintain that neoliberal economy. In terms of the self, it's all just about looking within and finding oneself, and one can't do anything else. And what this has really meant is a radical domestication of what were, in certain positions, certainly about the self, radical philosophical views at one time in the relatively distant past that have been so domesticated that they are all now succeeding in creating a sense that we really have nothing to do with our lives, but again, look within, find ourselves, and find out how, given who we think we are, we can sort of fit in the nice neoliberal order that we realize is kind of a disaster, but there's no alternative. It is a chilling moment in world history when you actually have a period in which there is a strong sense that there is no possible alternative. There's nothing else you can do other than simply look within and try to be happy to whatever remote extent we can within this world. That is horrible and chilling. Unbelievable we are living in such a world. And I think the political events of the past 2 years have demonstrated how radically unsustainable this is. And unfortunately, I suspect from the point of view of many of us, the beginning beginning of the breakup of that neoliberal order is coming successfully from a political point of view in terms of these right-wing authoritarian movements, and hardly, I suspect for many of us, a powerful response, because clearly these movements are direct flip the direct flip side of a neoliberal order. It is a chilling, chilling moment with potentially catastrophic implications of where this could take us in the very near future. That's the world we're living in. And given that that's the world we're living in, why in the world are we not radically trying to break up this world and radically looking for different alternatives? What is so chilling is what is not going on at this moment. It is extraordinary. And one of the reasons we wanted to teach this course was precisely for that. It is to make as strong an argument as we possibly can that, of course, there are alternatives. And if we correctly and rightly fear trying to create new totalizing isms, as we should, that has been disastrous, there's no question. But to then say, and therefore there is no alternative to the current system, is ridiculous. And we have to begin to break this world. Now, how do we do it? One of the overriding themes of this course has been, yes, we will try to allow our most fundamental assumptions to be challenged in any way we can. And certainly one of the goals of this course has been to say, oftentimes some of the most powerful challenges have been these extreme prophetic voices from the past that we have so domesticated that we don't even see as powerful anymore. We've so domesticated these ideas that Confucianism becomes nothing about following a bunch of rituals, and Buddhism becomes nothing about calming oneself down, and Christianity becomes nothing but simply going to a church and feeling good about oneself, which is, of course, ridiculous in all three cases. And yet we've so domesticated them that somehow they've again become non-alternatives, or even things that can kind of help us go through the day in the current world that's clearly making us unhappy. So you meditate a little bit, you calm down, and then, and in other words, we take the domesticated portions of these traditions and simply use them as nice medication to allow us to continue to go through the day and not change ourselves or the world around us. And one of the goals of this course, on the contrary, is to allow you to see these prophetic voices for what they are. Radical, extraordinary voices calling for radically different visions, and yet all sharing the basic view that you should begin with the assumption that what you are, these disturbing realities that Roberto was pointing toward, the fact that we are born into a certain circumstance, we buy certain assumptions of the world around us, we are patterned by conventions and customs around us, we fall into these patterns in our behavior that we ludicrously think are somehow us, somehow essential to our being. And none of that, therefore, becomes changeable, and it will completely determine our existence. All of these prophetic voices are completely committed to the notion that your first step is to break all of that. And what direction you go, needless to say, will be radically different with these different views. And yet, at least that first step they share. Begin by breaking these assumptions. Begin by breaking your idea that the world simply is the world and is unchangeable. You simply are you and you're unchangeable. And recognize in practice there are radical alternatives. Some of them horribly dangerous, but some of them potentially radically liberatory. That has been the goal of this class. And let me just close these remarks by making a plea to all of you. I am of the 1989 generation in America, a generation that I think future generations, if they exist, will look back on in horror. I am the generation that has lived these 30 years. I am the generation that saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, that thought, OK, the Cold War is over, that thought, OK, now finally we're building a nice world that we now refer to as neoliberalism, where everyone can be liberated and free, and there'll be vast amounts of wealth, and the end of the wars of the isms are finally over. And it's really been my generation that's created this sense that there are no alternatives, that somehow the way things are now is the only way they could conceivably be, and it's the best possible way to organize the world. And if that's been kind of the overarching vision that has been the case for my generation, think of us as a perfect negative example of how to live your lives. Do not fall into the horrors of what my generation fell into. Do not allow any of the powerful traditions at the moment to lead you to think there are no alternatives. Rather, commit yourselves to radically changing yourselves and the world around you, admitting the fact, I think it's an undeniable fact, that the world we've created in these past 30 years is an extraordinarily horrible one for 99.999% of the world's population, and commit yourself to not doing what my generation did. And going back to the major themes of this course, take seriously these grand prophetic voices that will call on you to break every assumption you hold dear, to go through a difficult period of suffering that will entail. It's a very difficult thing to allow your most fundamental assumptions to be broken, and yet it opens up possibilities that right now seem unimaginable, and that, again, powerful voices are telling you do not even conceivably exist. They do, and the call for this course is to begin that process. And if you do, hopefully, you will not look back in 30 years and think, my God, my generation failed. On the contrary, you should be able to look back in 30 years and think, my God, look at what things were like in 30 years ago. Look at where the world was going, and now look at the fact that we are creating upheavals that are finally opening up possibilities for those next generations that therefore might indeed be able to exist and perhaps even flourish. Thank you. So let's open it up. You should call on people.
I just wanted to say that for a number of years that I've been taking these courses in metaphysics and philosophy, I've been very depressed. But I finally got the answer. The answer is 3D printing. It sounds funny, but the point of that phrase is that modern human technology is on the verge of a sea change. That there's going to be a time in the near future we'll be able to edit the genome. We'll be able to cure cancer. We'll be able to get rid of all the debilitating diseases, which many of us are headed towards in old age. But these are real things. I don't think we're going to be able to change government like, I won't mention any names, but you know what all the governments are that are threatening to destroy the world with nuclear weapons. All of this will dissipate because these people, or the people that come after them, will be so fascinated with a new technology that's in its own way creating a positive statement that the human race will be, ironically, saved by the very technology which we invent, in spite of all the wars that we've endured and created. We survive them and we continue to create, and all you have to do is walk down the street to MIT, combined with Harvard, and it's fun, but it's also true, that we really have a right to think positive.
Now, you didn't get that answer from this class, did you? you thought that on your own. You worked that out on your own, though, right? No, okay. No, we appreciate that out there, brother.
Now,
Indeed.
now we can talk about everything, of course, now, and in the 16th, but I hope that part of our conversation will be about the immediate topic, which is, do we have grounds for choice among these approaches to the conduct of life? And what are those grounds? Or to what extent is this a blind wager, a wager in the dark? That's the topic. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't evade it. Mm-hmm.
So I do have one question on the grounds that we've got as enumerated.
Yes.
Temperament being one, condition in which we're born, and the pursuit of solace.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, from a self-change standpoint, I was trying to re-examine those to say, are these so frozen that we can't personally come back to each of these and revisit? We were born in a location, but we can get around the world. We can learn. So I want to inject a bit of optimism here and say perhaps if we look at these three grounds for choice that are disturbing, is there some light?
Of course, but that was the whole premise of my discussion, right? That we're not limited to those influences, that we can go beyond them. How far beyond them is the question that is presented. And in going beyond them, as you have just implied, we can go back to them, to those influences, and change them. Change their character, loosen them, so that there isn't just this simple contrast between blind causation and an impossible rationalistic ambition, that there's something in between.
There's a hand in the back, and then we'll go to this sister.
Thank you all three for your ideas and your discourse. And I guess I'm interested in the question of, the question of advancing technologies is not something that we can just put off to the side. It is something that is growing more and more quickly by the year. And I think one of the big struggles that we'll face as a species coming century is how do we reconcile these past traditions, these things that we're trying to that we're discussing, of course, about meaning making, about humanity and the choices that with existential choices, with this rapidly meteoric change in our technologies, in what is possible for human life, and even with the potential possibility of our human identity being changed by our own tools and our own technology. I mean, what thoughts do you have on these changes?
Yeah, I'll just throw out a few quick comments. I would say technology in itself is not going to liberate us. I'll begin with a clear example. Again, going back to 30 years ago, which was in retrospect, such a telling moment. When people began to talk about the possibilities of some new thing called the internet, we heard all these liberatory visions that, yes, with the internet, it will globalize the world, and you can connect with people all over the world, and this will break down nationalist boundaries and racism and gender stratification, and everything will become connected. Clearly, in retrospect, I think we have to admit that if, to go back to one of the themes of 2 weeks ago, one of our dangers as human beings is that we fall into these patterns that can completely dominate our entire lives, the ways we have utilized the internet has made that incomparably worse than it usually would be. That we are incomparably more patterned now than we probably have ever been. We are incredibly so manipulatable by our patterns that things like Google, Facebook, politically Cambridge Analytica have learned so easily how to help us, how to manipulate us, to buy things, to vote for things. It's incredible how patterned we are and how easily manipulatable we are. So here we have this potentially liberating technology that we've used for incredibly dangerous purposes. To go back to Abba's wonderful examples too, absolutely true, but it's equally true to say those exact same technologies you're talking about can be, and minus any changes we could make, I suspect dangerously will be, used to overly pattern us, right? We will learn to very quickly, this is coming very quickly, by the way, genetically modify children to be X. So we will decide intelligence means X, Y, and Z, and we will genetically modify them to be X, Y, and Z. And instead of working with the complexity of humans and helping them to grow, we will actually be using technologies to genetically create perfectly, well, this isn't the claim the scientists will make, but I'm saying in practice, perfectly patterned creatures, which would equally be perfectly manipulable creatures too by corporate interests, governments, etc. So I think technology isn't going to be the liberation. Now, it certainly can be. I mean, absolutely. But the key is simply going to come down to the themes we've been talking about here. If we are making the radical transformations we are making, technologies can be extraordinary. If we don't, they could make things incomparably worse. So it all comes down to what we do with them.
Absolutely.
So this is a little bit of a vague question, and I apologize for that, but it struck me when Professor West said, would it be understand that part of it is not limiting yourself to one point of view, whether it's neoliberalism or a certain religion. But I want to ask if any of you or all three of you have any perspective on how to make sure that those beliefs and choices and loves are authentically yours when we are very easily manipulable on the one hand. And second of all, I feel like there's so much in every person. Like to make them authentically yours, even today, because I think Walt Whitman said, I contradict myself very well, but I contradict myself. I'm large. I can be positives.
That's
I always
right.
felt that we can be true to ourselves within a variety of perspectives, religions, ways. And I'm genuinely curious. And if you have any insight on practices or perspectives to make them authentically useful in yours and not limited.
Well, that's profound. You can call it vague, but that's a profound question. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the paradoxes of voice is that you can't find your voice without bouncing up your emerging voice against the great voices of the past. But so that the voice is going to be tied to different traditions, but it's still distinctive, singular, unique in being yours if it actually is a voice that rings with something that is real relative to what you're willing to live, what you're willing to feel, what you're willing to sacrifice. I mean, all three of those when I talked about death and love and voice, you see. Because the measure is, for the most part, going to be what cost you're willing to pay. If somebody were to say to you, well, your love of your father or mother is not genuine. You're just willing to take a bullet in the heart. But other than that, it's not genuine. Well, what other measure do you have in terms of the life that you live? The same with you in relationship and so forth and so on, you see. So in that sense, there is an existential element here, which is a fundamental part of the measure of a life. Very much so.
The feeling tone of it.
It's a feeling tone, it's a texture, it's but it's manifest in the end in word and deed, though. It's the life lived, the actions taken, the sacrifices made, the service rendered, the patience enacted. All of those things are existential measures of life lived, you see. You want to jump? You all jump in as well.
I think Roberto, this goes to what you were saying. Let's say I'm ready to break my assumptions and make a choice, etc. Which, and to what extent will we free to make those choices? I'm already pretty pessimistic about that. And this goes also to what you were saying, about what's going to happen when everybody in this room is able to make those choices, but the vast number of people, the 99.999% that are affected by neoliberalism, don't have the time, don't have the energy, don't have the freedom, don't have the education to make those choices, to make those assumptions. How are we going to break out of neoliberalist world order? How are we going to do that? I don't want my brother in the back here to lapse back into depression, but I don't think we need anything is doing it.
So, and what's the, say more, so what's the conclusion of your online?
We have to both sit in the room and think about these different philosophies and traditions, and to grapple with ourselves, the people that have to work 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day to earn minimum wage and barely provide for themselves, how are they going to do that? How are they going to break out of the curse of the neoliberalist world order, or any ism, any nationalist identity, whatever it is, that doesn't afford them the freedom to make those choices?
It's true. So that the ability to exercise reflectively these spiritual options depends on material conditions and on the political transformation of society. Nevertheless, the whole of humanity now participates in some form in this spiritual life. It has some orientation to the established religions, and it receives the revolutionary message. For example, the worldwide popular romantic culture is carried through popular music and through the television soap operas to every Indian village or to every Brazilian slum and there's a response. So it's true that the ability to participate actively in this transformation depends on practical conditions. But it's not true that humanity doesn't already participate somehow, even under these severe material constraints. It does participate in this spiritual context already. Now, I just want to go back to a particular angle here, which I have tried to pursue throughout my interventions in the course, and which remained implicit in the remarks that I made at the beginning of the class. So there is this background of the so-called axial age transformations, this common element of the world religions. And I remarked that they all have this ambiguity of being either a convocation to change the world or a license to escape the world. It's like a two-sided ticket. Are they just a redescription, or are they an imperative of transformation? And then, now, in the last 200 years, there's been this revolutionary project in the world on both the political side and the personal side, and it wants to resolve that ambivalence. It wants to resolve that ambivalence on the side of transformation against the side of quietism or redescription. So that's this revolutionary project. But I think this revolutionary project is now lost. And that relates to the concern that you brought up of changing the material conditions of humanity. So the dominant ideological and institutional settlement in the world, in the rich societies, with influence throughout the world, was the social democratic settlement of the mid-20th century. And that settlement sought to humanize the existing social order, but abandoned any attempt to change the economic and political institutions. And now we know that none of the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies can be solved or even addressed within the limits of that compromise. So on the political side, the task is to develop an agenda of structural change through institutional innovation in the organization of the economy and of politics, a democratized form of the market economy, and a high-energy democracy that doesn't require crisis to make change possible. That's not been the focus of this course. So the focus has been the same problem on the moral side rather than on the political side. So the revolutionary project on the moral side, then, does not have today an adequate expression. So on the one hand, there is the prescription of a universalizing altruism, the concern of the academic meta-ethics. And on the other hand, there's romanticism, romantic adventurism. Those are the two tangible proposals that we have as expressions of the moral side of this modern project. And they're also inadequate. They're not adequate to carry this message out into a way of living. And that's been the object of this course. Because then the idea is for this revolutionary project to live as the next step of those revolutionary transformations of the axial age, we have to decide how it can progress on the moral side as well as on the political side. That's the agenda. And yes, go on.
But so I take a point. Moral side, it seems that we can't go through the moral transformation without the political or institutional transformation.
Yes and no. Yes and no, right? Because none of us gets to choose our position in history.
Right.
So we don't get to choose how far humanity has progressed in our lifetimes. because we live in biographical rather than historical time. And so then we have to have a way of living right now, because in the end all we have is now, that makes up for the failures of politics. So the transformative vision of having a greater life, becoming bigger, more magnanimous, or in the theological language, extending our share in the attributes that we ascribe to God, that has to have a translation into the way we live, regardless of the extent to which society has been transformed. So the less society has been transformed, the greater the burden on our moral correction. In other words, virtue has to make up for the failures of politics. And that's the problem that's presented to us.
I agree with you, Professor, but then I think we might fall into the trap that Professor Hewitt has brought up, where all we'd be doing there in increasing our own magnanimity and going through our own moral transformation is to then medicate ourselves without feeling any impetus to change the political system around us, precisely because we can't choose where in history we're born. And that might be all well and good. You know, I'm not saying that's a bad way to live, to go through your own moral transformation. I'm just saying that's not the way I want to live.
Of course not, but there's a relation, right? I mean, this is a very interesting problem, because how should we understand the relation between the collective transformation of society and politics and the self-transformation of the individual in his limited lifetime? So one extreme view would be we should make ourselves instruments of the collective project. We should sacrifice our lives for this collective betterment of humanity. And if we were to take literally the altruistic view, it would lead to that. But it's a dehumanizing view, because we're not ants, and we have this life, and we would be perverted, dehumanized, if we viewed ourselves as just instruments of this collective ascent of humanity. On the other hand, there can be the opposite perversion, in which we think of politics as just an occasion for romantic adventurism. So we engage in a political struggle, but it's an excuse or a pretext for having an interesting life and escaping from the constraints on the personality. And so these are the two unacceptable limits. So what we would hope is that we take politics seriously, this imperative of collective transformation, which now means going beyond the social democratic settlement, working towards structural change. But we don't treat ourselves as just instruments. So we believe that through this transformative activity, we help to change ourselves, that our struggle against the world allows us to escape from the rigidified form of our own selves and to go beyond romanticism or distant and universalizing altruism. So Nietzsche said, and he's not an example of what I'm proposing, but he did say, the life of every great man should be called not so-and-so in his time, but so-and-so in his struggle against his time. And that's what we should want for every human being, because there's this relation between our ability to make ourselves bigger and our struggle against the context. And so this is an essential part of the way of living life as a search that we would want to come after romanticism and after the universalizing altruism. So it's a whole moral vocabulary we have to develop, and a set of tangible ideas about how to live, in the hope that this would then become the common possession of humanity, and not just of an elite of privileged people who have more opportunity to reflect on it, but of everyone, in some form.
But just one quick point, then we move to the question here. When we make that distinction between the 1% and everybody else, that I think we want to be very careful and cautious in that regard, precisely because the 1% ought not to be our fundamental point of reference when it comes to alternative imaginations, analysis, and practice for transforming the present. You see, Harvard University has never been in the vanguard for alternative imaginations and practices and fundamentally transforming American society. Because the seductions are too overwhelming, the benefits are too overwhelming. Most move right into a mainstream given the conformity which is shot through the culture. Harvard has dished out individuals, you see. But Harvard in its dominant form, as part of the 1%, has never, and probably will never ever. That's not its aim. You see what I mean? It's the people who are struggling, who are coming up as artists, who sometimes, like Melville. What college did Melville go to? What college did Eugene O'Neill go to? What college did Curtis Mayfield go to? What college? We can go on and on. Carole King, on and on and on. You see what I mean? The people are wrestling with these issues, not in Harvard law classes. They're wrestling with these issues in their lived experience. And it's going to be whether Harvard students are willing and humble enough to acknowledge that they're not at the center of things for alternative imagination. So in the end, it's just a kind of revision. You accept that revision?
I like it, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm with you on that. Okay, no, go get it. So it's right here.
Yeah, so when we're talking about this onus for the people, I'm left wondering about time in terms of the scope of that goal. So over the course of this class, we've talked about, Mr. Unger, you talked about these 200 years, right?
Yes.
Professor West, you talked about looking at our lives from the perspective of our funeral,
Yes.
which is, 90 years if we're lucky. And Professor Hewitt, you talked about 30 years, a 30-year period. And I'm just wondering, when we think about these radical changes, how different does that look? How different should it look if we're thinking about 30 years, 90 years, 200 years, thousands of years? And where do we best locate the capacity to view people, all people, as fully human, right? The people we can picture in 30 years or 90 years, picture we can't picture thousands of years from now.
Yeah, that's a powerful question.
Fair.
It's just for you, though, brother.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. And what I would say is the good news, and it's going to sound weird when I get to the rest of my sentence, I would call this good, but I really do mean it's good, is we have no idea. And let me just give a very concrete example. I mean, at the moment, despite all of our claims of living in this wonderful age of radical social mobility with neoliberalism, I mean, the statistics are chillingly clear. We live in an age of almost no social mobility. If you're born into a certain position, you tend to stay there, and that is true across the board now, and there's no social mobility. If you look at other historical periods when there's been this little social mobility, they have occurred, and here's an example, late 18th century France. So late 18th century France is a time in which there's virtually no social mobility. You were born into a particular place. You stay there. You never move. Everything is based upon that. If you look at the intellectual landscape of the day, we like to look back and say, yes, but change was brewing because of the great, brilliant, radical Enlightenment thinkers. Read them. I mean, these are not radical thinkers. I mean, the Enlightenment thinkers, they're very important. I don't mean to be critical, but they were not calling for radical social change. I mean, these are people who are saying, let's not torture people, which is good. We shouldn't torture people. They certainly weren't calling, however, for social mobility. They weren't calling for kings to have their head cut off. Actually, what they would often do is they would write to rulers and say, you should become more educated. I mean, they had zero interest in changing the social world of their day. So you look at late 18th century France, and you're looking at a world of no social mobility, no immediately obvious ideas calling for any kind of radical change. And needless to say, 2-3 decades go by, and the world has totally changed, and then continues to change on an unbelievable, if anything, less than 30-year cycle over the next 200 years and ongoing. So you can go through periods, chillingly we're in one, that are unbelievably rigid, and yet things can begin to happen. And historians endlessly debate what really happened in the late 18th century, but regardless of those debates, in terms of us now, what it means is you begin by beginning these sparks. You begin where you can, which can be almost anything. It's going to be largely unpredictable what's going to work and what's going to explode, and getting back to the heart of your question, what even the time scale of that can be. But the fact that it's so rigid doesn't mean, wow, maybe in 300 years we'll create a more fluid society. In late 18th century France, bam, that was 2 decades. 2 decades. So it's incredible how quickly, it's chilling how rigid things can become and how long that can last. It's also stunning how quickly that can break apart. Now, it can also break apart in horrible ways. I mean, I think the past 2 years, we can see the hints of incredibly dangerous way this could break apart. And that's a very likely future of extreme right-wing nationalist authoritarian movements dominating the world and leading to another set of world wars. I mean, that's a very, very plausible immediate future. There are other possible futures, too, that we could not imagine. And so we honestly don't know the time scale, but therefore, fight.
But it's not all about politics and history.
Oh, yes. I mean, struggle
which
in
is
every
on this time
level.
scale of historical time. So, for example, we have this problem of our mummification. The individual has it, regardless of what happens to society. So the individual gets older. There's a rigidified form of the self, which is associated then with the acceptance of a position in society, a station, a situation. It's a combination of the rigidified self with the compromises of practical life. And together, that's then this mummy. And the individual begins to die within this mummy, many small deaths. That's a problem that we have regardless of the progress or lack of progress of society. And to live fully until we die, we have to break out of this mummy. So that's a part then of what we require as an approach to the conduct of life. And then our engagement with society, our attempt to be in the society without being of it, to be insiders and outsiders at the same time, has a reciprocal relation to this struggle against the mummy. Because the more we break out of the mummy, the more we can be in the society without being of it, and the more we're in it without surrendering to it, the better a chance we have of breaking out of the mummy. So our hope is that there's some affinity between our political stake in the transformation of society and our personal stake in the transformation of ourselves. And that's an essential part of these views if we are to progress. We can't imagine that our existence, our projects of life, are simply instruments of our political campaigns, because otherwise we produce this dehumanizing effect, which is self-subversive, self-canceling.
Yes.
Professor Unger, as you mentioned earlier, characteristic of the discourse surrounding first-order projects is the breakdown of the divide between is and ought.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, as we anticipate an ethical alternative that takes some of these projects into consideration, how might we expect this dialectic between is and ought to play a role, especially following and kind of on the heels of neoliberalism? And kind of to what extent could we anticipate moments of integration with kind of some of these meta-ethical projects in regards to some of the universal principles they suggest?
Well, the claim I made was that the disjunction between is and ought breaks down the more our views become global views. So the locus classicus, the source of this idea in the history of Western philosophy, is Hume. So Hume makes this claim that there's no jump from propositions about is to propositions about ought. But Hume himself, in the treatise on human nature, crosses the divide between the is and the ought, because he does present a comprehensive view of humanity. And in that comprehensive view, because it is a global view and not a local view, the distinction between is and ought breaks down. That's the claim I'm making. It makes no sense. The more comprehensive our view is, the more it involves a combination of empirical and normative ideas. And that's not something that to be invented. I'm claiming that's what's always been the case. And it's a confusion in our understanding of these positions to impose on them this grid of an analytical distinction between is and ought, which only makes sense for the local, not for the global.
But it's also true historically that the old religious narrative had is and art always intertangled and intertwined. It was the authority of the new physics. It was the new secular priesthood called physicists who tell us what the nature of reality is without generating art claims. And that had to do with the mathematization of knowledge, the quantification of knowledge, the manipulation of nature for the domination of humans over against nature, reducing nature from a thou to an it, with unbelievable technological results. We acknowledge that. We saw it manifest with our dear brother in the back with that 3D vision. Technology and science are two of the most seductive features and forces in the modern world. Right? But it's art claims left dangling, and Hume was simply responding to the new authority of the new physics and knowledge that tell us what is the case, the way they tell us what this table really is, and not this aesthetic object that has these shapes and so forth and so on. So, and that's part of the world in which we live. So then the question becomes, how do we talk about the blurring that is in art, given the fundamental role that science, technology, always under the aegis of social arrangements. Technology is always under the aegis of a particular social arrangement, tied to the mode of the kind of economy, the kind of government, and so forth and so on. You know, I mean, how much money does Harvard get from the U.S. government tied to science? But we're a private institution, right? The public and private begin to blur, precisely because of the relation of profiteering, government, major research university. That's not true for Haverford and Amherst, because they're just concerned with liberal arts and so forth and so on. So that you begin to understand in a very complicated way what these relations are. They're power relations on the one hand, even in regard to knowledge affairs, but also those old humanist questions of what ought to be the case, how ought we to live in light of these new kinds of realities in which we find ourselves. So it's a way of trying to just historicize and contextualize what the Humes and others were dealing with.
I think one thing that I do want to add in the discussion and I feel is missing is this. So, because something strange, it's not a rhetorical point I'm making, it's a genuine perplexity that I feel. If we examine these first order projects, the ones we've discussed in the course and others, all of us are going to be struck by the limitations, the defects of each of them. Absolutely. Like Emerson's view, Hegel's view. So we can't think that a real human being could take any of those too literally and live just by that light. So what should our attitude be? Should our attitude be an attitude of shapeless eclecticism in which we take a little bit from each? Or should our attitude be that we struggle to form a project, a conception, that these are inadequate, so let's build one that's more adequate? We do that in politics when we go from one agenda to another. Shouldn't we do that as well in our moral experience? So that's the question. And it's related to this conversation we were having about grounds, whether there are grounds or not. If there are partial grounds, however inadequate they may be, we shouldn't be satisfied with just some kind of taxonomy in which we describe a series of moral projects and they all seem patently insufficient, and then we think all we can do is to somehow combine them or take a little bit from each. That's not good enough. And so this whole project is an attempt to reach beyond that position. And so in my discourse about grounds, I emphasize this idea of inadequacy. And that may seem like a deflationary position. But actually the whole spirit is the spirit of saying eclecticism is not enough. And we're not confined to eclecticism. We can do better. So it's a hopeful view. It's a view that we are capable of forming a powerful moral agenda that goes beyond romantic adventurism and universalizing altruism, which are the only two developed agendas that we have as the moral expression of this revolutionary project.
But we're back to the difference between Chekhov and Tolstoy. That you've got epic ambitions. You've got a tilt toward comprehensive vision, whereas those of us who are highly suspicious of totalizing orientations, we can't be characterized as being eclecticists. We are characterized as being improvisational. That's a different notion. So we allow those of you who engage in this epic, ambitious projects and applaud the wings that you fly on, but we also know, and you know, that whatever you come up with is going to be inadequate. Shot through with deficiencies and blind spots.
Improvisation doesn't have a system, but it has a direction.
Yes, it does.
And so,
yes, it does. That's right.
So I don't insist on it being systematic, but I want it to have a direction.
But you had an architectonic tonality.
Yes,
in
but,
your
but separate that.
Is that fair?
I think that is fair.
We're all the victims of our temperament. But I'm not going to insist on the systematizing part.
Yes,
I'm just going to insist on it having a direction.
Okay, now,
and you'll compromise with that.
Okay, that's we moving towards some middle ground. Here and then the sister in the back, right on.
I feel like having a direction and having different approaches to realize that direction or to head in that, like, doesn't mean that all of those approaches are going to be completely adequate in every situation or in every historical moment. And so I don't have a good answer to your prompt. It's interesting to think of, but I wonder if the desire to come up with a new project is another way of trying to sidestep the same sort of imperatives that you put out. Except in this time, you're not trying to establish some transcendental reality or some transcendental unity that absolves differences. You're trying to find some transcendental plan that can somehow mitigate all of the discrepancies. And I don't know if that's possible, especially given everything you guys have put out. Like, we've seen millennia of history with rapid technological changes, same issues still there, just different forms. So I don't know. I'm more on the improvisation camp. But I see almost this idea of trying to create a completely adequate solution as just being another form of some type of theism or something, but theism of ideas.
No one is speaking for a quote, completely adequate solution. The thing is, the alternative really is the idea of the wager in the dark, right? That's the limiting position. So we could say, we have to make a choice. Everyone has to live in one way or another, to the extent that the material circumstances don't resolve the problem for him by compelling him to live in a certain way. But to the extent that there is a freedom of maneuver, there will be a choice. Now, what then can we say about that choice? Is it nothing more but this wager in the dark, in which we have to engage our lives in one direction or another, on the basis of these blind influences, where we were born, what our temperament is, how far we feel required to surrender to the pursuit of solace, and so forth? Or can we go beyond that? Now, if we can go only a little bit beyond that, that's already a revolution in our situation. And that's really all that's being discussed. It's not the idea that there's some system out there to which we can entrust ourselves. The whole question in this debate today is there any light at all? And what is the nature of this light?
This is in the back.
Thank you. So, Professor Pewitt, you talked about the domestication of radical traditions into non-alternatives.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, with all these examples of Confucian ritual or Buddhist meditation or church-going, things that make people feel better.
Yes.
How do you, two-part question. One, how do you skillfully present a viable alternative to feeling better to yourself or to others? And two, how can you stop domesticating something? Like, it seems there's part of it is just stopping what you're taming, what's wild, you stop doing that. but there's also like freeing what has been domesticated, and what if it can't remember how to be wild? How do you stop that process?
Yeah, great question. And like you, I side with the latter. So let me just begin with a very concrete example and then work from there for the larger point. So meditation. So here we are dealing with techniques, unbelievably effective, that were developed to break the self. To break the self, to break the entire world that we have created around the self, to break all of our assumptions, our ways of being, which through the act of meditation you come to see is simply a product of what we think of as our will, but really our base desires, and it breaks everything. So we have taken these incredibly powerful techniques and build them into kind of a version of self-help in which we tell people, practice these techniques and it will calm you down and you'll feel better about yourself. And you'll even see expressions on centers that will say this, saying things like, well, if you meditate, you learn to love yourself and embrace yourself and calm yourself down. So you can meditate in the weekends and then go back to your normal workday and be happier. In other words, you can be the same person you already are, doing the exact same things you already do, but you'll be calmer, less angry, and happier in that sense. Now, getting back to the heart of your question, people have therefore started, to a much grander degree in America, doing these techniques, being called in for that reason. There was a fascinating New York Times article about 3 years ago, and there have been lots of studies that this was based upon and ongoing, that actually started looking at people who were doing this. Because, as you were saying in your question, I mean, they are doing the techniques. And when they start doing these techniques, lo and behold, they don't start feeling calm and happy about themselves and happy about the world. I mean, it is a horrifying experience. And instead of having a teacher there with them saying, yes, it's horrifying and it's going to get much worse, and keep doing this, you've got a teacher that's saying, don't you feel great? And like the answer is no. And a lot of people are being really devastated psychologically by this. And getting back to, therefore, to your question, what do? Well, what we do is we really start doing those techniques. If you're doing that as that example, in other words, you really start doing it and you do the techniques to allow them to do what they were designed to do, which is to break ourselves and break our assumptions. And you make it as clear to people as possible, you are not going to be happy and calm if you do this. You are going to walk away not only a different person, you'll realize you're not really a person in the sense that you thought you were to begin with. So
you're not going to be happy in the first sense of happiness.
Exactly.
You're going to be
Absolutely.
happier in the second sense.
Indeed. Exactly. So I would say a key way to de-domesticate these ideas and these practices is to really start doing them and start doing them outside of our nice little vision of self-help and loving the self and embracing oneself, and really starting to do them and allow that work to do what it was intended to do, which is to break the way we are living our lives.
Jump right in.
Question prompted by Professor Unger's grounds for choice between
Yes.
projects. Why do the grounds matter as opposed to the effects that these
As opposed to which?
as opposed to the effects that these projects have on
Effects.
whether it's yourself or society at large? And presuming that they do matter, what's so bad about these?
Well, the effects, the consequences are among the grounds. As I gave the example of the going beyond the blind, what I call the blind influences. So the first ground, the first family of grounds are what happens when you enact these promises of happiness. Do they validate themselves or do they undermine themselves? So that's, as you're saying, consequences. The consequences do matter.
Perhaps I should have been more specific. Their material effects on life. Why isn't that more important than the degree of fulfillment of their metaphysical promises? That's the first thing. And then the second question that I have for you is prompted by your comments regarding the social democratic compromise.
Yes.
My reservations about social democracy as a whole, partly because I grew up in Sweden, which is sort of that of the idea. But with that said, the idea that it didn't affect any political or economic transformations.
No, I didn't say it didn't affect transformation.
I thought I heard you say that the social democratic compromise didn't achieve.
No, it was a particular kind of retreat from structural change in society. That's what, well, no. It, in effect, one simple way of understanding it by a first approximation is the forces that challenge the established organization of the market and of the state abdicated that challenge, and in return, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate more intensively, to attenuate inequalities retrospectively through tax and transfer, and to manage the economy countercyclically. So there's a humanization of the market order without any transformation. In a country like Sweden, compromise between the social democratic state and the dynastic plutocracies that continue to own much of the country. So, and it had a great historical achievement, which was a high level of investment in people and their capabilities. But now, the fundamental problems of these societies cannot be resolved within the limits of the social democratic compromise. That's the kind of argument. But it's tangential to the agenda of this course, because here we've been focusing on the moral rather than on the political side. So that's the basic answer. But I would feel sad if we were left with the impression that this moral agenda is suggested beyond altruism and beyond romanticism is empty. It has a particular content. So there's the idea is an idea of the enhancement of agency, of our self-possession. We become bigger, we become greater, and in two main dimensions. So one dimension is the relation of the self to the others. And in the intimate sphere through love, but beyond the intimate sphere through the construction of higher forms of cooperation in the economy and in politics. That's the agenda of institutional change. And that's where the personal connects with the political. But then there's the second dimension where the personal also connects with the political, which is the relation of the self in its context transcending ability to the concrete structure of society. We want to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. How can we construct regimes, economic and political regimes, that allow us to engage in them without surrendering to them? So they have to be regimes that organize and facilitate their own transformation, and that don't require crisis, economic ruin, or military conflict as the condition of change. And as we want that in society, we want that for ourselves, not to be then hostage to the rigidified form of the self, the character, the mummy within which we're dying. So there's a conception of becoming greater in a form of shared bigness and extending our share in the attributes that we ascribe to the divine. That's the general character, for me, of the agenda that emerges from these discussions. And one might approach it by Cornell's method, improvisationally, rather than through some system of ideas. But even if we approach it improvisationally, it has a direction. And that's what I really care about. I don't care about the method being systematic or not. I care about what the direction is.
And keep in mind now, I don't have a method. I got a vision, no method. There's a qualitative distinction between them. You agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Indeed. Now we're going to continue this conversation. One last question before we go? Because we're going to continue next week. One last question. Yes, yes, I saw your hand. I'm sorry. Yes, go right ahead.
So I was wondering, we've been talking a lot about happiness and how the pursuit of happiness is sort of the ultimate goal to achieve this personal fulfillment. I was wondering what's the role that you give also to sacrifice and pain in this whole picture, and particularly taking into account when you look at the figures of humanity who have achieved a major shift in the social structure. So I'm referring to, for example, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, went through this stage of martyrdom. I don't know if they were happier not in their personal life, but they went through this struggle to achieve something larger than themselves. So
Absolutely.
how can we become that a little bit more in that aspect?
No, I think that you've hit several nails on the head. There's no doubt that anytime we talk about love, that presupposes intense pain. You been in love before? So you know what I'm talking about? Absolutely. Okay. So that when we invoke certain notions, there's other family resemblances that go along with it. There's other notions that cluster around it. Same is true in terms of struggle for justice. There is no struggle for justice, critique, and resistance without unbelievable sadness, sorrow, wrestling, despair, all the things that go hand in hand. And you're right, Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Rabbi Heschel, Edward Said, Martin King, all of these are grand examples of persons who tied to love on the one hand of truth and goodness and beauty, and also tied to struggle for justice, undergoing their own lives. Stress, strain, pain, sorrow, sadness, all the things that go with it. You are absolutely right. And we're going to try to say even more the last week.
Cornell,
Yeah.
just to make clear that because although you may disagree with me, I don't disagree with you. So vision is what counts.
Yes.
Vision is direction.
That's right.
So methods can be useful provisionally, but methods are a dime a dozen. Methods are to be produced and then displaced. The only thing that counts is vision. And that's where we agree.
But that sounds like improvisation.
No, because this is a lower order, right? We can proceed improvisationally
Right.
or non-improvisationally. We can use methods and systems so long as we're willing periodically to destroy them.
Yes.
The evil is not to use them. The evil is to reify them.
That's right. And be captured by them.
Yes.
Oh, no, we agree. See you next week. See you next week. Indeed, indeed. I'm so sorry my voice is so off today.
Oh, mine too. Sinus infection. Of course.
Boy, this is good stuff for y'all. I'm telling you, this is good stuff.
No, I was trying to keep it going before you. Yeah, well, I didn't want to be like rude. There's an art to being to have these sorts of I guess I was trying. I said, oh, and then I thought you were asking, you were like, what violation are you